In Lusaka, Zambia, life in the small home of Chanda and Lillian was filled with quiet sacrifices no one ever noticed. Chanda was a man with dreams of his own, but he buried them so that Lillian could chase hers. Day after day, he cooked meals, swept the floor, and fixed whatever was broken. He became the invisible hand holding their shaky marriage together. Yet the more he gave, the more Lillian tore him down. She laughed at him in front of others, dismissed his efforts, and spoke to him like he was nothing. Chanda kept swallowing the pain, believing that silence was strength, but inside, every word was carving scars. One evening, as the air in their house grew heavy with tension, Lillian's temper snapped. Her voice was sharp, almost cruel, as she spat the words he would never forget, "Stay home, you useless." The sound echoed through the walls, piercing deeper than any physical wound could. In that moment, Chanda felt the weight of years of humiliation crash down on him. Her words were not just an insult, they were a sentence, a verdict that declared him worthless. For a second, the room fell silent, but inside him, something broke and something new began to rise. That night was different. He did not cry, he did not beg, and he did not explain. He simply stood taller, his silence louder than her anger, and the world he once carried on his back suddenly felt lighter, as if he was preparing to let it go. Chanda looked like a man who had given up on life, at least that's what most people believed. He was quiet, always in the background, doing chores, running errands, and making sure the house stayed in order while his wife Lillian chased her own ambitions. To the outside world, he was a husband without pride, someone too weak to stand up for himself. Even Lillian saw him that way. She thought she had broken his spirit with her sharp tongue and endless insults. But what she never knew was that Chanda's silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Behind that calm face was a man who had been planning his escape for years, carefully hiding a part of himself that she could never control. When Lillian mocked him for not having money, Chanda smiled quietly, but inside he knew the truth. Every time she wasted cash on things that didn't matter, he saved what little he could. Every small job he picked up on the side, every little bit of change that passed through his hands, he put it away. He studied, he learned, and he watched the market. Slowly, without telling anyone, he started investing. It wasn't much at first, just tiny amounts in opportunities he researched late at night when everyone else was asleep. But brick by brick, coin by coin, his hidden world began to grow. Lillian never imagined that the man she called useless had accounts she didn't know about, connections she couldn't see, and dreams she never cared to ask about. To her, he was invisible, a shadow in her life that served her needs. But outside that house, Chanda was turning into something else. A friend in Kitwe had once told him about starting a logistics business. Chanda listened carefully, put his secret savings on the table, and joined in. While Lillian was busy putting him down, he was busy laying the foundation for a future she would never be part of. He kept his victories quiet, never bragging, never hinting. Even when the first contract came through, he walked into the house as if nothing had changed. He cooked dinner, cleaned the dishes, and nodded when she insulted him again. But in his heart, he was smiling. He knew a storm was coming, not to break him, but to lift him. The man everyone thought was weak, the man his own wife dismissed as useless, was now standing on the edge of a transformation so powerful it would silence every cruel word she had ever thrown at him. Chanda was never powerless. He was patient. He was building quietly, waiting for the right moment to rise. And when that moment came, the world would no longer see him as invisible. They would see him as unstoppable. That night something changed forever. The words, "Stay home, you useless," were still hanging in the air, but Chanda did not collapse under their weight like he used to. For years, he had bitten his tongue, carried his pain in silence, and convinced himself that one day things would get better. But this night was different. Something in him finally snapped, not in anger, but in strength. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his head, and looked Lillian directly in the eyes. His voice was calm, but every syllable carried a force she had never heard before. "You will never call me useless again." The words cut through the room like lightning. For the first time, Lillian's mouth froze. She was used to his silence, used to him bowing his head and walking away, but this was not the same man. The quiet Chanda she mocked every day had disappeared, and in front of her stood someone she could no longer control. The silence in that room was heavy. Even the walls seemed to listen. Chanda did not raise his voice, yet it felt louder than every insult she had ever thrown at him. His calmness was more frightening than if he had shouted. Without another word, he turned and began to pack his suitcase. One shirt, one pair of shoes, a few documents. He didn't take much, but he took the most important thing with him, his dignity. Each fold of clothing into the bag felt like closing a chapter of his life. Lillian stood there, watching, but for once she had no words. Maybe she thought he would cool down, maybe she believed he would come back after a few hours. But the look in his eyes told her this was final. When he zipped the bag shut, it was as if he sealed away years of pain. He carried it to the door, paused for a moment, and looked back, not at her, but at the house that had been his prison. Then he stepped into the night. The air outside felt different, lighter, almost like freedom itself was waiting for him. His heart was burning, yes, with hurt and betrayal, but it was not broken. It was alive, beating stronger than it ever had before. He walked without hesitation, without fear, without a backward glance. Each step was a clap back louder than any words could ever be. He wasn't running away. He was walking toward himself, toward the life he had secretly been preparing for, the life that no insult could take from him. That night, Chanda's silence ended, and his story of strength began. He left behind the woman who doubted him, the walls that hurt his pain, and the shadows that kept him small. From that moment on, he was no longer the man everyone underestimated. He was the man who finally chose himself. When Chanda walked out that night, he carried no riches, no grand possessions, and no support from anyone. All he had was a small suitcase and a heart full of quiet determination. For years, he had lived in silence, sacrificing his own dreams to hold together a marriage that gave him nothing but pain. But now that silence had turned into fuel. The insults he had once swallowed became the fire that pushed him forward. Away from Lillian's shadow, he finally had space to breathe, space to become the man he had secretly been building all along. Chanda had not left blindly. Hidden behind his quiet routines was a dream he had been working on in secret, a logistics startup with an old friend in Kitwe. While Lillian mocked him at home, he had been planning routes, studying supply chains, and saving every coin he could to invest. He knew Zambia's growing cities needed better transport solutions, and he believed he could provide them. What looked like weakness to his wife was actually patience, because Chanda had been waiting for the right time to act. And now that he was free, nothing could hold him back. The beginning was not easy. He stayed in a small room, sometimes skipping meals just to save money for the business. Days were long, nights were longer, and there were moments he almost doubted himself. But every time he remembered the words, "Stay home, you useless," his resolve hardened. He promised himself he would never again let anyone define his worth. Slowly, his efforts began to bear fruit. The first contract came through, a small delivery deal that barely covered costs, but it was proof that his idea worked. Then another client signed on, and then another. Within months, the tiny startup began to grow faster than he had imagined. Chanda transformed before everyone's eyes. The same man who once carried groceries and endured insults now carried files of contracts and shook hands with business partners. His phone, once silent, now rang with opportunities. Companies in Lusaka and beyond began to recognize his name. He was no longer the invisible husband in the corner of a crumbling marriage. He was a man in demand, respected for his work and admired for his resilience. Each milestone felt like a victory over the years of humiliation he had endured. Every signed contract was more than money, it was a reminder that his sacrifices had not been in vain. He had walked out of his old life with nothing but belief in himself, and that belief had opened doors he once thought impossible. Chanda was finally free, not just from Lillian's ridicule, but from every chain that once held him down. And with every step forward, he proved a simple truth: sometimes the quietest sacrifices lead to the loudest freedom. The city of Lusaka is small when it comes to gossip. News travels fast, and soon everyone was talking about Chanda. The same man who once walked the dusty streets quietly carrying groceries for his wife was now being spotted at the airport, flying out for business meetings in Johannesburg. People who once overlooked him started asking questions. Who was this man really? How did he rise so quickly? The whispers grew louder with every passing week, and the name that used to draw laughter now carried respect. Chanda was no longer invisible. He was a man everyone wanted to know. Back in the neighborhood, things looked very different for Lillian. The house that once buzzed with her arrogance had grown silent. Bills piled up on her table, and the laughter she once shared with neighbors at Chanda's expense had turned into long sighs of regret. The same neighbors who had joined her in mocking him now whispered about her instead. They remembered how she used to boast, how she called him useless so freely, and now they shook their heads in disbelief. The man she discarded was appearing in financial magazines, his face on glossy pages, his story of resilience spreading far beyond Lusaka. At first, Lillian told herself it was just luck, maybe a short-lived success that would soon collapse. But the gossip refused to die down. More people returned with stories of seeing him at conferences, of hearing him give talks about logistics and entrepreneurship. His company's name started to appear in newspapers, attached to new contracts and partnerships. Each headline was a slap of reality, each photo a reminder of the man she never truly saw. Inside, Lillian was drowning, not just in unpaid bills but in shame. The neighbors no longer respected her. They spoke kindly of Chanda, admiring how he had stayed patient, how he had endured humiliation quietly, and then turned that silence into something powerful. To them, his story was inspiring. To her, it was torture. She had laughed at him, and now the world was laughing at her. Meanwhile, Chanda's life was transforming at a speed that even he sometimes found hard to believe. He traveled often, signed deals that secured his company's future, and met leaders who once would never have noticed him. Each success reminded him of how far he had come. He never bragged about Lillian, never tried to expose her cruelty. He didn't need to. His success itself was the loudest clapback. What shocked everyone the most was not just his financial rise, but his dignity. He carried himself with calm confidence, never bitter, never vengeful. People admired that even more than his wealth. The man once dismissed as useless had become a symbol of strength. And as the whispers about him spread, so did the silence around Lillian. She was left to face the truth alone. The man she tried to bury had risen higher than she could ever reach. Years passed, and life carried Chanda far from the man he used to be. His business had grown beyond borders, his name was respected in circles that once would never have given him a seat at the table. Yet fate has a way of circling back, and one day it brought him face to face with the woman who once tried to crush him. It happened at a family wedding, a gathering filled with music, laughter, and colorful clothes. Chanda arrived quietly, dressed in a sharp suit, his presence calm yet commanding. He did not come seeking attention, he was simply there to celebrate. But the moment Lillian saw him, old bitterness rose in her eyes. She looked drained, her face carrying the marks of stress and regret. The sparkle she once carried when mocking him was long gone, yet she still couldn't resist sneering. Maybe she thought she could remind him of the past, reduce him again to the man she once controlled. But before she could say much, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. The MC tapped the microphone, smiled, and with a loud voice announced the chief sponsor of the wedding. All eyes turned as he said the name. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Chanda." The hall fell silent for a moment. Heads turned, mouths opened in shock, and whispers ran through the crowd like fire. The man they once dismissed, the man some remembered as that quiet husband of Lillian, was not just a guest, he was the one who had funded the entire event. Respect filled the room, and every corner seemed to bow to him without a word. Lillian froze. Her sneer vanished, replaced by wide eyes and trembling lips. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, what she was seeing. The man she once called useless was now standing tall, commanding honor from everyone present. Guests rushed to shake his hand, elders blessed him warmly, and younger relatives looked at him with admiration. His name echoed with dignity, while she sat there shrinking in her chair, unable to hide from the truth. Chanda, however, remained calm. He did not gloat, did not even look her way with pride or anger. He smiled at those who approached, thanked the MC, and carried himself with the quiet grace of a man who knew his worth. That was what cut Lillian the deepest. His success did not need her acknowledgement, and his presence did not need her validation. He had become someone far beyond her reach. The hall celebrated him, but for Lillian, it was the longest evening of her life. She could feel the whispers around her, the curious glances, the unspoken judgment. Everyone remembered how she used to treat him, and now everyone could see how wrong she had been. In that single moment, without raising his voice or saying a word to her, Chanda had given her the most powerful reply she would ever receive. He had risen, and she was left to watch. Lillian had never known shame like the one she felt after that wedding. For days, the whispers haunted her. Neighbors who once laughed with her now avoided her eyes, and those who dared to speak only reminded her of the man she had lost. She replayed that moment in the hall over and over again, the moment the MC introduced Chanda as the chief sponsor, the moment the entire room celebrated him while she sat frozen in disbelief. The man she had mocked, insulted, and thrown aside had become everything she once wished she had, and the reality was too heavy for her to carry. Humiliation slowly turned into desperation. Bills were still piling up, her lifestyle was slipping through her fingers, and the people who once entertained her arrogance no longer cared to visit. Loneliness pressed on her like a weight, and every night she thought of Chanda. She remembered the times he had cooked for her, cleaned for her, and endured her cruelty with silence. She remembered how she used to laugh when he bent down to serve her, never knowing that the same man was quietly building an empire. Regret sank deep into her bones, and finally, she made a decision: she would swallow her pride and beg for another chance. When she finally stood before Chanda, it was not with the same arrogance she once wore. Her eyes were heavy, her voice shaking, her hands trembling. For the first time, she admitted her mistakes. She told him she had been blind, that she had failed to see the man he truly was. She begged him to forgive her, begged him to let her return, begged him to allow her a place in the shining world he had built. The desperation in her words was raw, and for a moment, the air around them grew heavy. But Chanda did not flinch. He looked at her with the same calmness he carried on the night he walked out. His success had not made him bitter, nor had her humiliation made him cruel. When he finally spoke, his words were steady, measured, and unforgettable. He repeated the very insult she had once thrown at him, but this time, they carried a different weight. "Stay home, Lillian. Stay useless." The word struck her harder than any insult she had ever delivered. She broke down in tears, realizing this was not anger speaking. This was finality. Chanda wasn't seeking revenge, he didn't need to. His life was already proof that he had risen beyond her reach. What he gave her was closure, the same way he had given himself closure years before when he walked away. As Lillian wept, Chanda turned and walked once again, but this time his steps carried no pain, no burden, only peace. He had closed the chapter with the same dignity he had opened it. For Lillian, the regret had come too late. For Chanda, it was the end of a story that no longer had power over him. Chanda walked out once more, but this time it felt nothing like the night he had left his marriage behind. Back then, he had walked into the unknown with only faith to guide him. Now, he walked into a future he had carefully built with his own hands. The man who was once mocked as useless had become a name of respect, a story of strength, and an example of how patience and silence can turn into power. He did not carry bitterness with him. The whispers of the past no longer mattered. The shame Lillian now carried was her own, not his. The neighbors' gossip, the laughter that once rang in his ears, all faded like dust behind him. He had no need to prove himself anymore, his life already spoke louder than any words could. He had risen above, not by fighting back with anger, but by building a life so bright that those who doubted him could only watch from the shadows. Every step forward was freedom. Every breath was lighter. Chanda had learned that true victory doesn't come from shouting back at those who insult you. It comes from proving them wrong by living fully, by becoming everything they said you could never be. And as he moved ahead, he carried only one truth with him, a truth that would echo forever: the best clapback is not noise, not revenge, not even words. It is success so undeniable, so radiant, that it blinds the very people who once tried to dim your light. Chanda walked into forever, leaving behind the pain of yesterday and embracing the brilliance of tomorrow.